Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm here with Gary Cohn. Gary, good afternoon. It's a pleasure being here with you again. Gary was, for those that don't know him well, Gary was director of the National Economic Council in the first 2 years of the Trump administration, which made him the key economic advisor inside the White House. Before that, Gary had a brilliant career as an investment banker at Goldman Sachs, most of this time as a trader, but recently he became president and chief operating officer in the last years and helped to manage Goldman during different moments, including the deep crisis in 2007, 8, 9, and where I had the pleasure of met Gary and learn a lot of things with him. And Gary was part of a brilliant generation of Goldman partners, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And most recently, Gary now beyond doing nice conversations like that, seminars or hearings in the different universities, is also an investor in different segments of venture capital. Certainly a better life than the previous ones. So, Gary, welcome. It's a pleasure being here with you.
Andre, thank you so much for A, having me, but B, for those undeserved and very kind and very warm welcome. I hope I can live up to the welcome introduction.
Well, Gary, we are, as we discussed, in a very different world, right? We had, of course, this COVID-19, which is an amazing, unthinkable surprise that changed countries and societies in the whole globe, completely unexpected. On the top of that, we had another different event, which was an oil crisis, both on the supply side and on the demand side. On the top of that, we have this China-US relationship that was there well before the pandemic, but certainly will continue to be there. Maybe it's just the beginning of that, and certainly very present in US elections in the next months. And finally, we had this unfortunate situation in US and with a lot of protests that now not only in US but in a number of different cities around the world. So it's a number of black swans at the same time, as like to say, probably too many black
Yeah.
swans for the same lake, right? It's a
Yeah.
different moment for us. I will start for a non-economic matter, right? This protest that we are seeing. And I remember that in 2017, you made, I think, very important and at that time, very courageous comments about a crazy event of white supremacists in Charlottesville, that rally that was completely unacceptable. And you made very strong comments and asking in your own government to a more energetic response to that events. And now we are seeing it's not the same case, right? But we could include in the same package this kind of situation. How you are seeing these protests and what is happening in the society that we are having situations like that?
So, Andre, first, let me start out and say what's going on with the protests in the United States is not uncorrelated to what's going on with COVID and the US government response to COVID. Remember, our government here in the United States made a decision. And look, I think at the time, with the knowledge that we had, it was the correct decision to, in essence, shut down the entire US economy except for the most essential services, which was basically medical care, food, and pharmacies. Every other business in the United States was shut down. And in doing that, they also, I don't think they thought through this, but in hindsight, it's very clear, they also shut every small business in America. and they allowed the largest businesses in the country to stay open because they deemed those businesses to be quite essential. So when you take 30, 40, 50 million Americans and you tell them to stay home for the greater good of the country, and we're trying to flatten the area under the curve to make sure that we can control a healthcare crisis in the United States, and you shut schools and you put people out of work and you don't give people any hope, you really change the way people think about their future. And I think we saw a lot of this. We saw the fact that the minority community in the United States, even in the best of economic times, and one could argue how good or how bad our economic times were pre-COVID, but we, from an economic data standpoint, had very good economic times. If you measure it by unemployment rates, if you measure it by GDP, you measure it by stock market, by the basic measurements that we in the markets or economists use, the US economy was doing very well. But the minority community, they were not benefiting as much as the majority community in the United States. So there was a pre-existing condition in the minority community that was there, but as long as the economy was moving, we were able to tolerate it. Once we shut down the economy, we shut down the schools, we shut down all hope, we really saw these protests come out and bear the reality of something we had been dealing with in the United States. And as you said, Andre, we dealt with this 2 years ago in Charlottesville in the United States, and we've dealt with this other times in the United States, but they've been in better economic times. In many respects, this may be a very crucial turning point here in the United States, where we have to deal with the reality of who we are in the United States, what our population looks like, what our future demographics are going to look like, and how we're going to live together, work together, and strive and thrive together as an American country. And I'm very optimistic that we've gotten to that point where we're finally going to have some very difficult discussions. And these are very difficult discussions. We're going to look at the policing of this country and how police are disciplined and how police are hired and how police are fired. And that's really important because we've had a union system that protect policemen. But look, that to me is the tip of the iceberg. Because once we start looking at the way we hire policemen, we can look at the way we hire teachers. And the way we hire teachers is no different than the way we hire policemen. We hire teachers in a union contract where the last teacher in is the first teacher out. So if you're a 40 or 50-year veteran teacher that's been teaching in a school district, and you're not technologically savvy and you can't really relate to the kids, but you've been there for 40 years, versus a new teacher that comes in today with 2 or 3 master's degrees and can relate to the kids and understands technologies, in any budget cut, the youngest teacher, because they're the last one in, gets fired. So we're literally in an opportunistic point now where we may be able to make really substantial changes in the country that we've all known have needed to be changed, but we've never been able to facilitate that change. And this may be the opportunity where we say, look, once and for all, we've got to figure out how to drive our economy from the bottom up. And when I say from the bottom up, it starts with primary education. It starts from kindergarten, first grade, and goes all the way through secondary education. It goes through how we hire government employees, how we promote people, how we retain people. And there's a huge opportunity here. And in many respects, in spite of what's happening here, and look, I'm not going to candy coat it. We're suffering here in the United States right now. In many respects, we may come out of this a much better nation when we get to the other side.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Gary, just exploring this point, you led the approval of the tax cuts in the beginning of the administration, right? And for which, by the way, the act was Tax and Jobs Act, right?
Yep.
And
Absolutely.
which I think was certainly the key economic achievement of the Trump administration. And for many analysts, if not the vast majority of them, the key reason for this fantastic success of U.S. economy measured by or financial asset prices or unemployment rates, right? Unemployment
Yep.
were in all-time lows, and equity markets were in all-time high. That's before the pandemic. On the other hand, in this extremely successful society, you have more and more and more the discussion about inequality, which is part of your answer of the previous discussion. But why we'll move in the right direction, and given this relevant debate about inequality, and the other day the two of us were talking, we were talking about corporate inequality, right?
Right.
Which is another face of the same problem. But how can we avoid the populism answer to this inequality? Because at the end of the day, US produced a 300 million country of up middle class people, right, for global standards. And just being very market driven, very economic responsible, pretty rational. How to avoid populism on this discussion about inequality?
Look, Andrea, you touched on 5+ good points in your question, and I'll try and be equally as relevant when I answer it. So if you go back to our Tax and Jobs Act, the core premise of the tax plan that I had the benefit of being the driver of was that we were going to cut we did, not that we were going to cut the corporate tax rate in the United States. And the key reason to cut the corporate tax rate in the United States is for the last 20+ years, we had seen businesses leave the United States because they were leaving to go to other countries where they could hire people, manufacture their goods, manufacture their services, and import them to the United States and reap the lower tax rates that those countries offered. We saw the Irish be very successful at this after they went through their very difficult economic times, where they got tax rates for corporates down in the mid-teens. And if you set up a complicated structure and you had technology, you could get your tax rates into the single-digit levels, where we in the United States were 30+% corporate tax rates. So the big initiative was to get the corporate tax rate down, have companies not only stay in the United States, but return to the United States, because we were no longer disadvantaging companies by being US domiciled. And so that's why we called it the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The big question the United States has to answer, and this is a bigger question than it ever has been, is what do we want our economy to be? Because we have spent the last almost century turning ourselves from a manufacturing economy to a service economy. We are now in a position where 75+% of our economy, both jobs and income and GDP, is based on the service sector, and it's not based on the manufacturing sector. Do we want to go back? And by the way, we may need to go back and become more of a manufacturing economy. I think we saw this with COVID. We saw the risks of importing PPE, personal protective equipment. We saw the risks of importing some of the pharmaceuticals that we needed from other parts of the world. We saw some disruptions in food supply chains. So in many respects, I think the United States right now has to say, we've now seen the effects of a global pandemic. We now understand where our vulnerabilities are. How do we protect ourselves in the future to make sure we are a self-sufficient country? And what do we need to incentivize, and how do we bring back businesses to make sure we can thrive by ourselves? That will change the mix of jobs in the United States. I think that many minorities can end up being in these businesses, and hopefully they can end up owning and driving many of these new businesses that have to be built in the United States. These businesses aren't going to be built overnight, and the US government's going to have to decide they want these businesses here in the United States, because initially it may be more expensive to domicile these businesses in the United States. But this is a big, fundamental opportunity for the United States to become more domestically secure. And it's also a big opportunity to diversify the workforce into just not service jobs, but a combination of service, manufacturing, supply chain job that we really have outsourced to the rest of the world.
Yeah, but Gary, when you look at, let's take 2019 or the pre-COVID life, where US was growing emerging market, good emerging market kind of growth rates, right? And higher than any other G7 country. And unemployment was at all-time lows, right? The key economic discussion is how low can we go and without any inflationary pressure. And part of that was this optimization of supply chains and productivity hunt all the time. Um, is it possible keeping the same economic pace and moving this to this shape? And of course, I completely understand that critical supply chains will be nationalized, right? As you said, medical equipment, other defense industry, a lot of key segments of the industrial production will be nationalized by US and I would say by a vast majority of countries, right? And the part of that will be a market reaction because companies don't want to have their supply chain vulnerable, and part of that by regulation in critical sectors. But having this movement, which is at the end of the day a reduction in productivity globally, combined with that fantastic picture that we had before the crisis, we can live with these two words, or something needs to change. Eventually, we have more inflation ahead of us, or higher rates, so we need to balance these somehow.
Well, look, Andre, before COVID, so go back to, I don't know, March 1st, not that long ago. We had very low unemployment numbers. We had no inflation. We still had very low rates, not just in the United States, but in the world. And a lot of what I'm describing you is not a US phenomenon. It was a bit of a global phenomenon. We still had Japan with negative rates. We had Europe with very low rates and very low growth and very low inflation. Just because we had low unemployment numbers didn't mean we were paying wages to people that they could live off of in the United States. And I think one of the big changes that's going to come out of this COVID crisis here in the United States is the whole definition of a living wage and what you're going to have to pay people to do jobs. And the cost of labor is going to go up in the United States. I don't think it's possible that we come out of what we've been through with the corona crisis, what we've been through with understanding the plight of minority communities in the United States, and we don't change the wage scale and the accountability scale in the United States. Does that lead to inflation? I think initially it probably doesn't, but over time, for a variety of factors, and I'm not just saying this as a wage factor, I do think we will ultimately get to some rampant runaway inflation, more because of what we're doing on central bank policy and the fact that we just keep flooding money into markets. Today, once again, the Federal Reserve announced something that we never thought would be possible, that they're actually going to buy corporate bonds. We now have a Federal Reserve Bank in the United States that grows their balance sheet at an ever-growing capacity. At some point, there is a cost to the fact that the Congress keeps appropriating trillions of dollars of money to American citizens that, look, what needed to be appropriated when the crisis first hit, and the Federal Reserve and other central banks around the world continue to use their balance sheet in different forms of quantitative easing. I just don't believe that every central bank around the world is going to get to build their balance sheet up and miraculously just get away with it at no cost and do it at zero to negative interest rates. But it's not going to happen overnight. This is not a 2020 or a 2021 problem. But as I look through the decade, it would not at all surprise me to see real inflation return to the system.
I just want to explore a little bit more of this point, right, Gary? Because, well, before being a senior government official or a venture capitalist, or even CEO of a large financial institution, you were a fixed income trader, right? Which is a very interesting species. how was your financial take on this 15 trillion of negative rates bonds, right? You answer part of that, but just be more specific. It's amazing, right, for our generation to
Yeah.
see. And for me, it's the the biggest imperfection in the financial world, right? But I would like to listen to your view.
So, Andrea, I don't understand it. Look, I don't understand negative interest rates. I'll be the first one to admit that I don't understand negative interest rates. Um, when I was at I'll say when I was at Goldman and we built what at the time and probably the 90s was this state of the art risk management system. We didn't even build it that it would ever take negative interest rates, I was told after I left. Because while I was there, we never had negative interest rates, and the whole system went sort of haywire once we had our first negative interest rates in Europe, in Asia. So this concept that I pay you to hold my money, or I give you money and you give me less back in the future, I don't comprehend. I mean, I comprehend it, but I don't understand why anyone would do that. I remember it must have been 3 or 4 years ago in Switzerland. I think it was right around a Davos meeting that I was talking to a bunch of Swiss business executives, and the Swiss National Bank had just gone negative for the first time I could remember. I said, God, I'd really like to be in the safe business or the vault business, because you would think you'd just go out and buy safes and take printed currency and put it in the safe. It would be cheaper than giving the Swiss National Bank your money and getting less back. I'd rather secure it in a cast iron vault. So the concept is so foreign to me, and it disincentivizes all the natural behaviors that we want from the G7 world, where we've got an aging population and we want people to be more self-sufficient and think about their retirement and save for their retirement and de-risk their funding as they get closer and closer to retirement. It takes every financial theory, personal financial theory that I ever learned about, and throws it out the window, because it says, look, you should save money and build a nest egg earlier in your career. You take more risk as you get closer to retirement, you de-risk, and as you get to retirement age, you put cash in the bank, because that's how you're going to live your life in a smart, prudent financial way. But no one's ever going to put their money in the bank and put put a real in or put $1 in and take 0.98 out.
Yes, I agree with you. It's quite strange, right?
It is quite strange.
Gary, moving a little bit outside of economy and finance, but going to a more geopolitical topic. Well, we have this U.S.-China relationship since the pre-COVID moment, right? And it's normal, right? If you go back 10,000 years of what we can call modern history, every time that you have a new global power coming, it's a moment of tension. Most of the times it ended up in wars, which probably will not happen this time. But how you see the U.S.-China relationship progressing, right? How this tension, it will get worse, will stay as it is, and we'll be managing that for a couple of decades. Certainly to be a hot topic in U.S. elections. And so what's your take on that?
So unfortunately, the current administration has very much politicized the U.S.-China relationship, and it has become a battle cry a little bit in the Republican platform and the White House's economic agenda. Anything that doesn't work out well in the United States, or anything that they don't like in the United States, they tend to think that blaming China for it is a good political solution, and it plays well with a lot of the Republican base. I personally don't believe that. I personally believe that we and China can live very complementary lives with each other. Yes, there have to be ground rules, and yes, we have to engage each other, and we have to understand where the rules of engagement are. But the Chinese, to me, have a very simple economic model at this point. Outside of the communist dictatorship that they live in, so they can change their economy around quite quickly, and they can put people to work quite quickly because they don't have to earn return on capital. The biggest and only risk economically for the Chinese is employment. They need to keep their population employed. Therefore, they continue to create as many state-owned enterprises as they need to create, to hire as many people as they need to keep employed, so they can pay them to live a life that they give is that they have enough comfort that they can put food on the table and have shelter. It's not at the levels that people around the world would be comfortable with, but the Chinese are comfortable with it because it's what they know. So the Chinese are always trying to build more manufacturing and export more goods. The United States, on the other hand, as I said before, we continue to try and build out our service economy. So, and so does Europe, and so do other places. So we, in many respects, are very complementary to each other. And this is the point that I tried to make while I was in Washington. To the extent that China can manufacture goods at a cheaper cost than we could manufacture them ourselves in the United States, and we allow US consumers to buy those goods at a lower cost, that gives the US consumer more disposable income to buy what we manufacture in the United States, which is services. It allows you to go buy more Starbucks coffee. It allows you to go to more restaurants. It allows you to go to more dry cleaners. It allows you to go to more nail salons or hair salons, or everything that you see down every main street in every American city that we have. So in many respects, we want you, or should be encouraging American citizens to buy the least expensive products that we can buy. So I always felt our relationship with China was somewhat complementary. Yes, when we get to necessity goods, there's a discussion here on pharmaceuticals and things like that. The current administration thinks that we should be more and more in the manufacturing business. I don't believe the US is a good manufacturing economy. I think environmentally it doesn't work, and I don't think people want those jobs. So I think that the relationship between us and China is really quite a reciprocal arrangement and works for both countries. What we need to do as the US, on the other hand, is we need to make sure we're exporting back to the Chinese our service economy. We need to be exporting back to them our accounting services, our banking services, our consulting services, all of this, our Starbucks coffees, our food, Yum brands, but these are big brands in China. We need to be exporting back. And what I think politically we need to do is we need to make sure that the Chinese are open to our service companies if we're open to their manufacturing companies here in the United States. And as long as that happens, it's a win-win. And I don't think anyone wins when the White House or anyone else in Washington blames China for our ills, because these are not our ills. These are decisions we made. We made a decision that we want to export manufacturing and import the final goods to the United States.
Yeah, and looking at the other hand, you had the privilege of a number of senior conversations with Chinese officials and business people. And how do you think the Chinese elite sees US? They would be happy with the status quo of them being the producers and consuming service. This combination for them is okay. They are mature about this concept.
Yeah, they are. Look, the Chinese have two inherent issues that they need to solve. They need food and they need energy. So the fact that the United States, one of the things we actually do produce, and we do produce it well, you do in Brazil, and you're the natural competitor to the United States here. In fact, you're a better competitor for food than the United States, because you happen to have two growing seasons where we have one growing season. If the United States and China got together and said, look, the Chinese, you're going to take food from the United States. You're going to take massive amounts of food. You're going to take LNG, liquefied natural gas, because we've got huge abundance of natural gas in the United States. So you're going to take food and liquid natural gas. We're going to take the following goods back, and you're going to take the following services. I think there's a very amicable solution to be had there. But instead of an amicable solution that I think could be negotiated over a very short period of time, because you're right, I've had lots of conversations with the senior most people in China. I think politically, the current administration would rather be fighting with China because they think politically that wins points with them. They blame the Chinese for things that go wrong in the United States. So if you ended up having this big bipartisan trade agreement with China, where they took what they needed and we took what we needed, we wouldn't have China to blame.
Yeah, I agree with you. Well, you mentioned the energy sector, Gary. Just for us to talk a little bit on the oil industry, which is oil is probably the most important commodity, and we had a double shock in oil, right? With the demand, with the COVID, and the supply, with this mismanagement of Saudi and Russia relationship, which is we don't know how much is mismanagement or management regarding the shale of U.S. What's your take on the oil world, given it's so important for global markets?
Well, again, I think the Saudis in particular and the Russians followed made a very strategic decision that when they saw the demand destruction in the United States and they saw the fact that the vast majority of independent gas producers and many of the small independent oil producers in the United States were already in financial problems because of the demand destruction in the United States because of COVID and the fact that everyone stopped driving, factories shut down, and there was no real demand. And it just so happened we happen to be in what we call the shoulder months, the spring months where demand goes down, March, April, May. You know, there's no heating demand and there's no air conditioning demand in the United States. So those are low demand months to start with. I think they made a pretty big, and I think this was a calculated decision to simultaneously flood the market with supply. And the view was that we're going to take some short-term pain, they being Russia and Saudi, take some short-term pains for some very long-term gain, meaning that they were going to get many of the poorly capitalized small gas and oil producers in North America, both the US and Canada, and they were going to force them out of business, force them to cap wells, have those companies go into bankruptcy, really close in an awful lot of production. And as the price went lower and lower, close in more and more production, and they were going to keep the market sort of saturated for 6 to 8 months. And then once they thought the economy would naturally return, demand would come back, that supply would be gone, and the Saudis and the Russians would be there to fill the void, and they would take prices up as demand came back. And by the way, if you look at a pure fundamental supply demand market, which oil and gas really are, because the last molecule prices the whole day's consumption, they are the market you can get away with it. There's very little storage relative to the daily consumption. You've got 2 or 3 countries that really have a disproportionate amount of the supply, and they can store it because they store it by not pulling it out of the ground. It was supply demand economics 101. It was really the basic way you do it. I'm not sure they realized how quickly the US economy was imploding, how much demand destruction there was, and how horrible this was going to be. And so therefore it became quite political for the president of the United States. The president had been very good to the Saudis. The president has gone out of his way to protect the royal family in Saudi Arabia. And it got to a point where the president had to use his political clout with the Saudis and the Russians to call let's say a ceasefire in the over demand and oversaturation of the market. I mean, we did see spot oil trade to negative $35 a barrel in the United States as a futures contract expired, because literally there was more oil in the system than there was places to go with it. And look, this will be the long-term textbook case study of supply and demand.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yep.
Unfortunately, it was distance the days of you as a commodity trader, right? Where you started.
Well, it was interesting to watch it for someone that grew up in the commodities business and took a lot of delivery of physical cargoes and physical commodity in my life and stored a lot of commodities in my life. and delivered a lot of commodities, because
Yeah.
anyone that grew up in that business always knew this could happen.
Yeah, one day it would happen.
Yep.
Yeah. Gary, moving before we talk about US recovery, let's talk about the pandemic itself. And well, neither you nor myself, we are not scientists or doctors, but we have been talking to a number of them as much as we talk to business people these recent months, right? It's
Yep.
and well, markets got nervous end of last week, and in a certain way still are, with this possibility of a second wave, especially in US. You are seeing numbers of states like Arizona or California or Florida slightly higher.
Yep.
How you are feeling about that? You are more worried about the pandemic, or you think the wave is done and things will be better here? Vaccines will be with us in 1 or 2 quarters. How you are the synthesis of all of your medical by the way, you are part of boards of hospitals and so on,
Yep.
and historically have a lot of connections in the area. So, what's your take on the pandemic itself?
So Andre, look, of all the answers I'm going to give you today, I will tell you up front, I have the least confidence in this answer. And I'm not a doctor. I'm not an epidemiologist.
Which is a responsible comment, right?
Right. No, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I was on TV last week and I argued that what's going on right now, this is the first wave. I don't think the first wave ever ended in the United States.
Absolutely.
We've had about 20,000 cases a day now for the last 4 to 6 weeks. It's just moved. It's moved from the Northeast to the South, to the Southwest. So we're literally just moving across the United States. The amount of cases hasn't really changed. It's just changing geographies. So to say we're going to have a second wave would mean that the first wave would end. And I'm not sure the first. And look, I'm pretty sure from my trading background, I would still say we're in the first move. The first move is slowing down, but it's still pretty steady. No one absolutely knows if we're going to have a second wave or not. You know, everyone I talk to, whether they're Washington related, they're hospitals related in New York, you know, they basically are modeling this off the 1918 Spanish flu. They're saying, look, this is what happened in 1918. That's the best model we have. And the thing came back with a huge vengeance in the fall, in September, October. And we should all be prepared for it to come back with a vengeance in September, October. You know, the one thing I think I do know, because no one knows for sure, is in the hospital system and the hospital boards I'm on, we have a lot more information about COVID today than we did in March. You know, unfortunately, we've had lots of deaths and lots of doctors have been able to do pathology work on the deceased human beings. So they know exactly what happened to the organs, how the body reacted to certain medicines, how the body's reacted in certain ways. And there's many views that the treatments that we were trying when we didn't know anything might not have been the right treatments. And there may be a lot more information and knowledge on how to treat us the second time. I think we're also much better prepared as citizens right now of wearing face masks, washing our hands. We understand what social distancing is, and hopefully we can continue that. So, you know, look, there's a great fear that this is 1918 and the disease comes back stronger than it came back the first wave. And there's a great deal of optimism that the medical community is much smarter, will be substantially more prepared, and we as citizens are a lot more knowledgeable, and we're doing things much more naturally today than we ever did. And I know every time I get in my car, I hit the sanitizer and I wash my hands. Every time I walk in my house, I wash my hands. I don't go out without a mask. And I think it's becoming more natural behavior for us. So hopefully, the worst is behind us. But like I said, that's the answer I'm the least confident in.
It's a responsible disclaimer.
Yeah.
But Gary, we've going back and trying to connect the dots of everything that we discussed here. Well, markets are, even with this correction of end of last week, close to all-time highs. It's a fantastic recovery. And a certain index more techy heavy, even in all-time highs or close to them, like Nasdaq or the overall S&P. Do you think markets are ahead of fundamentals, or is just all this central bank monetary ultra aggressive expansion plus some early signals in China, more concrete signals, or even in US with the unemployment numbers of last week, that the recovery will be there? Life is getting back to normal. If you go to Europe, you can notice that. So
does that mean you're going to Europe on vacation, Andre?
No, no, it doesn't mean I'm more concentrated here.
Okay.
Just a few days.
Because I'm not going to Europe anytime soon. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think this is an interesting discussion. So back to where we started this conversation, an interesting phenomena happened, and it happened around the world. And look, this was not premeditated. There was no malice intended here. But when the governments around the world shut down all the non-essential businesses and left the essential businesses open, it just so happens that the essential businesses of the world are the biggest companies that make up the biggest stock indices of the world. And they shut down the small, little, minority-owned, family-owned businesses that are not publicly traded, that no one really knows their valuation, no one knows what their earnings are, but those companies are absolutely doing horribly right now. So we were forced as a global population to shop from the largest companies in the world. We were forced to stay at home and work and use the technology from the largest companies in the world. We were forced to communicate over digital applications like we're on now, provided for us and by us by the largest companies in the world. We were forced to create more broadband use by the largest companies in the world. So in a unintentional way, the governments of the world made the biggest and most important companies much more important than they ever thought they would be. And they made the smaller companies substantially less important than they ever thought they would be. And it's a horrible, horrible thing that happened. And we have to find a way to reverse it. But when you look at the Dow Jones Industrial Average, or you look at the S&P 500, and the S&P 500 is more interesting, but when you look at the Dow, the 30 companies that are in the Dow, 25 of them we're using every day to live our lives right now because we have to, because they're the companies that are providing for us. So they've gained more market share, they've gained more revenue, they've gained more pricing power, and they're probably not going to lose those clients. So in many respects, I think the stock market's reflecting the fact that the governments, without trying to do this, have made those companies stronger and have given them more client reach. The second part of it is the central bank question and the negative interest rates and the zero interest rates.
Yeah.
You and I, you're younger than me, but even you learned this. I'm still sure they were teaching this. I learned in school that the way to calculate the value of an equity, it's the discounted present value of future cash flows or future earnings. Well, it used to be if a company was going to earn $1 10 years from now, if you discounted that back, it was 8 cents. So what were you going to pay for 8 cents? Well, today, if a company's going to earn $1 10 years from now, it's $1. So you can pay a lot more for $1 than you can for 8 cents because interest rates are zero or negative. So again, it dries up the valuation. So the fact that discount rates are basically zero, the bigger companies have gotten more important because they were there to serve our needs and they were deemed essential. I think the stock markets are more right than wrong. That doesn't mean that I'm raging bull on the stock markets, because if we get a second wave, even the most important companies in the world will have a tougher time serving us because, again, even if I'm ordering from Amazon or I'm ordering from the biggest, the Target or Home Depot, if they can't get people to supply them and the supply chain breaks down and people can't go in there to work, their sales are going to diminish. So I think you have to be careful, even though I think those companies are in phenomenally good position because we've given them almost monopoly powers.
Yeah, in this sense, Gary, to explore one angle of what you said, because eventually central banks are going too far in terms of selling a put to the markets, right?
Yes.
It's trying to avoid any sort of turbulence or disruption, which is part of the job description. But how do you think? Is there any chance of eventually going too far and trying to artificialize this environment of no disruption, no crisis, no recession, and eventually creating a much bigger asset bubble that, well, in the future, uh, create more problems than what we're living?
Look, I think that possibility does exist, and in fact, we may be, and I'm being very careful. We may be living through that. Again, this is one where we're not smart enough to know because we don't know if we're in wave one and it's done, or we're in wave one of 5 waves of the virus. If we knew what the path of the virus was, we knew what the path of the vaccine was, we knew what the path of people going back to work and returning to normal economic participation, we could say, oh, the central banks of the world are going way too far. But if we said, oh, this is just the tip of the iceberg and it's going to get substantially worse, we might say central banks aren't doing enough. So in many respects, I'm highly complimentary of the central banks around the world for their ability to get involved, use their balance sheet, use their liquidity, try and create as much normalcy as they can in asset market, in financing market, in the repo market, based on the knowledge they have today. They don't have any more knowledge on what September is going to look like than you or I do. So therefore, I think if you're a central banker, your risk is to underinvest and overinvest. So you've got to take the risk that you end up putting too much money, too much liquidity, and too many assets on your balance sheet versus not enough. Because if we get to September and there's a massive second wave or a second and third wave, and you didn't do enough, you probably are going to be blamed for it. But if you did too much, you can explain, hey, I didn't know I had to do it.
Yeah, which is certainly is the choice, right? I think
Right.
Powell's speech last week was clear around that,
Yep.
right? It's
And I don't Andre, I don't disagree with that. If I was sitting
yeah.
in Powell's chair, there's not a decision he's made that I would have done differently. And I would have been a lot more nervous about it than he appears to be.
Yeah, it's an important statement because,
Yeah.
well, you still have a chance of sitting in that chair. Oh, having said that, I'll move to more relaxing topics.
Okay.
How is life as a venture capitalist, Gary, and how you are seeing from this privileged position this big transformation? And I would ask first specifically on fintechs, given your deep knowledge
Yeah.
on the banking industry, but also on the overall spectrum that you have been investing. How has been the recent life? Certainly much more relaxing than the previous 30 years, but
Well,
yeah.
it was more relaxed pre-COVID. I will tell you that. Pre-COVID, life as a venture capitalist entrepreneur was actually a lot of fun. Since COVID, like every business in the world, except for the largest companies that were deemed essential, almost every company I'm dealing with, has lost 3 or 4 months of productivity. If we're building products, we're doing it remotely. If we're testing products, we can't be testing products. We've really lost all the momentum we had in all of our companies. And so you end up burning through a lot more cash than you planned on. Your product completion dates get pushed out. So you're dealing with fundamental reality of spending more money, taking longer to get the product to market, and either investing more money, raising more money, firing people, cutting salaries, or taking money from the government, all of which are horrible answers. There's no easy answer. You know, one of my companies, we sold, we merged to a bigger company because we were running out of cash. So look, even when you're in the venture capital world, you deal with the realities of a distressed economic environment. And so you can only imagine how small entrepreneurs that don't have the financial capacity that a lot of these entrepreneurs have, is hard for them to deal with. That said, Andrea, the amount of creativity and the amount of ideas that are in incubation around the world today is nothing short of extraordinary. You know, I saw, you know, pre-March, I was seeing, I don't know, 10 great ideas. I was probably seeing 30 ideas a week and 10 of them were great. Like I could have invested in all 10. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough money to invest in all 10. So you had the luxury of sitting there and having brilliant entrepreneurs. And by brilliant, I mean brilliant with their ideas. Some of them were high school dropouts, but they had unbelievable passion about what they were doing and the problems they could solve, and the desire to build a business or to build a product. It really is extraordinary how many more things we're going to see invented and created in our lifetimes in the short relative history. In the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see massive change. One which you mentioned is fintech. You know, I wrote an op-ed for the Financial Times how I thought that money would become obsolete, how I'm going through COVID without touching any paper currency, which I feel bad if I need to try and tip somebody. But I'm trying to go through the going through the COVID crisis without tipping anyone, and you can do it. You know, you can literally pay for everything digitally. You can use your iPhone or your Android phone, and we're getting so sophisticated, and I'm working with 2 or 3 companies that are going to make the ability to pay people and move money literally from individual to individual, from device to device. It's going to be as seamless as literally reaching in your pocket and peeling off a piece of currency. And so I think that's going to be a radical change in the world. You're going to be able to tip people because you're just going to literally zap money back and forth to people.
God, that's good. And Gary, you are one of the key builders of modern banking, more specifically investment banking, right? Most of your life and your career, you were helping to build modern Goldman Sachs. And what is the transformation that you see for looking 1 or 2 decades ahead of us in the banking industry? I know that you are bullish on Latin America investment bank, right? I know very bullish. You are always, right?
I always was. I always have been.
Sector.
I always was. I've always thought you had a great business, Andre. I'm always jealous of your business.
But what transformation you see in banking for the future, looking at this big fintech exposure that you have right now?
Well, look, I think as you get more and more digital and more technology gets into the commercial side of banking, the banks, which are now all highly integrated between commercial banks and investment banks, they're going to get to spend less time on the commercial banking because it's going to be so digitally interfaced. They're going to be able to serve their clients better. They're going to serve their clients more efficiently. And their clients are going to be happier because they're going to have a digital interface with the bank. And they're not going to need to go to a branch. And they're not going to need to go to an ATM. And they're not going to need to do the things that take time out of their day. And it's therefore going to free up the banks to be much better bankers for when their clients need help financially. And therefore, they're going to be better partners or counterparties in the sales and trading world, in the underwriting world, in the loan origination world. And they'll be able to extend credit farther down the credit spectrum. So we call it in the United States thin file credit applications. People that don't have credit history, which you deal with in Brazil a lot. You're starting out with people that are first-time borrowers, first-time credit cards, and trying to build a credit history. The digital application to build out credit files and build that out is just extraordinary. It's much more efficient than trying to do it through a conventional branch banking system. And then it allows you as an investment bank or a commercial bank or a combined, whichever one is combined today, to spend much more time with the clients that are building businesses and hiring people and growing the economy.
Yeah. Well, Gary, we are arriving to the end of our conversation. I have one final simple question. You had a little bit more than 2 years in the government and managing critical situations and saving the day a number of times, and good moments, bad moments is always tough. What was the key learning from the government experience, right? What a senior businessman can learn from this 2-year period that you were there managing?
Well, first of all, I'd say that it was probably the single best experience of my life. And I really mean that. And I always tell people I've had one of the luckiest lives that people could have. You know, I've had some of the best opportunities and best jobs and been in some of the most interesting situations and been in some of the rooms where some of the most interesting deals have been cut, and going to the government for 2 years tops it all by far. And I'd encourage any person that gets an opportunity to work in any government around the world for some period of time, that A, you should do it for yourself, and B, you should do it for your country. We'd all be better off for it. So number one, that's important. You know, just seeing, you know, how the government works. Both the good and the bad of government is really interesting. You know, it's hard to get things done in the government. And, you know, in the United States, our founding fathers made it hard on purpose. They did not want a centralized government to be able to just haphazardly change laws on people. So it's very difficult to get laws and bills and tax policy changed in the United States. So you have to have such unbelievable tenacity to be able to get something done. So, you know, in the Senate, you've got 100 senators, you need 51 votes. And in the House, you've got 435 House members, and you need 218, really need 219 to get something done. And being able to count to 51 and 218, it's one of the hardest things in the world, because, you know, you can go into someone's office in the morning and say, are you supporting the bill? And you spend 2 hours with them and you convince them to spend time, and they say, yeah, I'm going to vote. And so you put that one in the yes column, and, you know, you get to the end of the day and you think you're like 1 or 2 votes shy, and you hear on the news that they're not going to vote for you. So, you know, it's just a perpetual effort of trying to create positive momentum in the right direction, and dealing with the realities that it may not be about right and wrong. It's always about politics, and you got to make right triumph over politics. And it's a fascinating experience to make right triumph over politics.
And by the way, you succeeded, my friend, passing the Tax Cut and Jobs Act and saving the day a few times. It's not only important for US, but I think was important for the rest of the world. Again, Gary, well, thank you very much for the nice conversation. It's always a pleasure talking to you, my friend.
Andre, thank you so much for the great questions and spending time, and congratulations to you and your organization. You guys continue to amaze me what you've been able to do at Pactual and what you've been able to do in Brazil.
Okay. Thank you, Gary. Bye-bye. Have a good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
A crise chegou. E agora? Agora você se informa, você pesquisa, você vê os números, você tenta ver o que vem amanhã. Agora você acompanha as lives e conteúdos diários do BTG Pactual, com grandes nomes do mercado sobre o agora. Disponíveis até para quem não é cliente. Acesse btgpactualdigital.com/lives.